What connects a Jewish queen in an ancient Persian palace to the headlines coming out of Tehran today? How can a story told in Susa more than 2 millennia ago help explain the tense triangular relationship that now pins together the United States, Israel, and Iran? If you listen for a pattern rather than a prophecy stamped with a date, the Book of Esther offers a lens, not a map of military operations, not a timetable of events, but a recurring script of human pride, political plotting, and the possibility of reversal that has echoed across the same landscape into our own century. I want to take you through that lens, first as history and drama, then as geography and archaeology, and finally as a way of seeing modern shifts in Iran from a pluralistic Western-facing monarchy into the revolutionary theocracy that reshaped the region in 1979. Along the way, we'll be careful. We'll not claim that every headline is a literal fulfillment of scripture. We'll not conflate an entire people with the agenda of its rulers. But we'll watch how a narrative born in Susa, the court intrigues, the decrees that cut so deep, the sudden reversal, keeps reappearing wherever power becomes absolute and hatred becomes policy. If you want more deep dives like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. In the courtly corridors of an empire that once stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, a political drama unfolded that reads with the sharpness of a modern thriller. A young Jewish woman, orphaned and raised by her cousin amid the imperial capital, unexpectedly becomes queen. Her cousin, a man of principle, overhears and foils a palace conspiracy. A royal favorite, consumed by hatred, engineers a decree that would annihilate an entire people. The queen, risking death, approaches the king without invitation. The portrait of power reverses. The would-be destroyer is destroyed. The threatened community is vindicated. A holiday of remembrance and reversal is born. We know this story as the Book of Esther. The city central to its action is Susa, called Shushan in older readings. That palace and those gardens are not only literary stage sets. Archaeology and historical memory tie those scenes to real places, to ruins and strata and the names that persist on maps and in travel routes. The same soil that sheltered Esther's life and the royal edicts later witnessed empires rising and falling. Millennia later, that same geography became the territory of a modern nation-state called Iran, whose leaders and policies have, at times, echoed the rhetoric of rejection and annihilation. Let me tell the story plainly, vividly, because the power of Esther lies not only in its theological reflection on providence, but in the human texture, fear, calculation, courage, and risk. It begins with displacement. A Jewish boy named Mordecai, a man of faith and principle, is living in the capital far from Jerusalem. The empire rules with absolute royal authority, and the king conducts a search for a new queen after deposing the previous one. Among the captives brought to the palace is Esther, a young woman whose beauty and discretion attract the court. She is placed in the king's harem, and by grace and favor she rises until she is chosen as queen. Mordecai, though he is nearby, refuses to accept special honors that would compromise his loyalty to his people. It is here that ordinary palace life collides with extraordinary malice. Haman, a man elevated to the king's favor, stumbles upon Mordecai's refusal to bow. Whether out of wounded pride or deep-seated hatred, Haman decides on a scheme far beyond private insult. He seeks a royal decree to annihilate an entire population, men, women, and children, because of one man's perceived snub. The machinery of imperial law, once set in motion, proves difficult to halt. A king's edict, sealed with ring and parchment and stamped across provinces, carries the force of irreversible authority. In the logic of empire, such decrees are not merely suggestions, they are final. Esther, who has kept her heritage secret upon Mordecai's counsel, learns of the decree. The text makes clear the stakes. To approach the king unsummoned is to risk death, unless the king extends his golden scepter. Mordecai exhorts Esther to remember who she is and what she might lose if she remains silent. It is one of the sharpest moral calls in Scripture. If you remain silent, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from elsewhere. But who knows whether you were made queen for just such a time as this? With resolve, Esther calls for a fast. For 3 days, she and her people humble themselves, seeking wisdom and favor. Then she goes to the king, not with accusations or petitions, but with invitations, a feast prepared for the king and Haman. Pride and malice meet grace and hospitality. At her second banquet, Esther reveals her plea, a people threatened, a law set to kill. The king, moved, asks who is the adversary. Haman, who had come full of festal vanity, hears the answer and is smitten by the very fate he had plotted for others. The instrument Haman had prepared for Mordecai, a gallows, becomes the place of Haman's own death. The royal power that had engineered the massacre is turned by the queen's courage into a mechanism of salvation. A law that could not be rolled back is, in effect, countered by a new policy and by the agency of the vulnerable who dared to speak. The Jews enact a festival to remember both the danger and the deliverance. Purim becomes a liturgical and communal retelling of terror turned to triumph, a ritualized memory of how human plots can be overturned. The theological thrust is not a simplistic guarantee. The book nowhere names God explicitly in many of its sections, and providence there is often implied rather than spelled out. Yet the pattern is unmistakable. Scheming pride, a decree that seems final, a faithful remnant daring to act, a reversal that leaves the proud humbled and the vulnerable vindicated. Read in isolation, Esther is a courtly narrative of rescue. Read with attention to place, and with an eye for historical echoes, it begins to look like a template. Susa was not an anecdotal location. It was one of the capitals of a vast imperial system, a hub on trade routes, a seat of power and bureaucracy. The cities that hosted such courts are the same places where later empires built monuments, and where modern states would, centuries on, raise their own banners and build their own arsenals. Archaeology helps anchor the story not only in the imagination, but in space. Excavations in what scholars identify as the site of ancient Susa, today within the borders of modern Iran, have revealed layers of occupation spanning pre-Achaemenid, Achaemenid, Parthian, and later times. Palatial foundations, glazed bricks, and surviving artifacts align with a picture of an administrative center rich in monumental architecture. Nearby Hamadan corresponds to the ancient city of Ecbatana, another seat of Persian authority mentioned in the broader biblical tapestry. When travelers of later centuries recorded tombs, synagogues, and the memory of Jewish families in these regions, they were retrieving a continuity of presence. Jewish communities did not vanish after the exile. They remained, adapted, and inscribed themselves into local histories. Physical evidence is never perfectly one-to-one with narrative claims, and archaeological interpretation has limits and debates. But when ruins match the contours of the texts, palaces that could plausibly host royal banquets, administrative centers consistent with decree-writing empires, a plausible historical frame emerges. It matters that the geography persists. The same passes, the same mountain routes, the same river valleys that once carried royal messengers would centuries later bear caravans of goods, armies, and diplomatic envoys. Geography is stubborn. It outlives ideologies. That stubbornness is part of why a story that unfolded in an ancient palace can be read again when the stakes of power are raised in the same region. That continuity of place is matched by a continuity of human presence. Jewish communities have maintained a presence in the Iranian plateau for millennia, their cultural and material traces woven into the tapestry of local life. Under some regimes they thrived, under others they were constrained. Cyrus the Great, centuries before Esther, stands in Jewish memory as a liberator who issued an edict allowing exiled peoples to return home, an early instance of imperial policy that intersected with Jewish destiny. Later figures in the biblical corpus, Daniel, Nehemiah, also navigate realms of foreign power. These recurring interactions between Jewish communities and Persian structures of rule are part of a longer, complicated history rather than one isolated event. Fast forward through centuries of imperial ebbs and flows to the early 20th century. The land that once hosted Susa and Ecbatana became the modern nation-state of Iran, and under the Pahlavi dynasty, particularly during the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah, Iran pursued rapid modernization and deepened relations with Western powers. For a time, the Shah's orientation favored secular modernization, Western alliances, and strategic partnerships that included covert and overt cooperation with Israel and Western nations. Iranian Jews during this period often found relative protection and even opportunity in urban centers. Social and economic life allowed for pluralism of sorts within the boundaries set by the state. This is the point where the historical line becomes tragically instructive. A polity that had lived with a measure of religious and cultural diversity shifted toward a different axis when the foundations of authority and legitimacy were recast. The 1979 revolution did not simply change who occupied the palace. It altered the underlying theology of governance. Where the Shah's legitimacy rested in monarchy and modernist narratives, the new leadership claimed a theological mandate that made the state's identity inseparable from a particular vision of religious law and revolutionary purpose. The rhetoric of state policy moved in ways that foregrounded ideological opposition to certain actors abroad, and Iran's foreign posture took on new and often adversarial tones toward Israel and, by extension, toward the United States, which the revolutionary leadership viewed as the nearest guarantor of the old order. When you compare Haman's rhetoric to the language that emerged from revolutionary Iran, a pattern appears, though not an identity. Haman publicly painted a group as subhuman, as a threat to the social order. Revolutionary leaders, for their part, employed dehumanizing tropes and maximalist slogans directed at the policies and existence of a national entity that they regarded as illegitimate. The mechanics differ. Ancient court gossip and personal vendettas are not the same as modern media campaigns or state-sponsored support for proxy movements. Yet, the rhetorical move is similar, naming an enemy in absolute terms, depicting them as an existential threat, and then using instruments of state power or influence to marginalize and, at worst, seek their removal. Here the pastoral voice must insist on a distinction the headlines often flatten. The regime is not the people. Millions of Iranians are not the architects of state policy, and the civic texture of modern Iran includes secular-minded citizens, religious minorities, and a cultural diversity that resists simple caricature. Similarly, the Jewish presence in Iran has had a long arc, one that includes sorrow, but also resilience and rootedness. Treating the regime's rhetoric as if it were the unanimous voice of an entire people is a moral and analytical mistake. And yet, the resemblance is troubling enough to merit reflection. Power corrupted by ideology, a legal system weaponized, and a populace caught between the arrogance of rulers and the vulnerability of ordinary life. The lesson of Esther does not map neatly onto the nuclear fears, proxy conflicts, and diplomatic standoffs of the 21st century. But it suggests a pattern. When leaders absolutize a narrative of exclusion, when they craft decrees or policies that seek to erase or delegitimize others, history often pushes back, sometimes by human agency, sometimes by unexpected circumstances, and sometimes by forces beyond human planning. The possibility of reversal is theological as much as political. It is not a promise of immediate deliverance, nor a prediction about military outcomes. It is a reminder that the arc of events often bends in ways that humble the proud. As we move into the modern era, the strategic terrain that once hosted royal messengers now hosts airfields, embassies, and proxy networks. The same crossroads that made empires ambitious also makes modern states able to project power. After the revolution, Iran invested in forms of influence that extended beyond its borders: support for militias, rhetorical alignment with groups opposed to Israel, and an international posture framed in revolutionary terms. For Israel and the United States, these developments recalibrated threat assessments. No longer were the chief concerns limited to classical diplomacy. They now included asymmetric warfare, ideological warfare, and a regional chessboard where non-state actors became instruments of state policy. Yet to frame the situation purely in military terms misses the crucial theological and historical texture. The Book of Esther reminds us that decrees, once issued, stick to the fabric of life. They change calendars and cast long shadows over families. But it also shows that the law is not the only arbiter of history. Courage in the right place, the refusal to bow to fear, and political finesse can unmake a plot. In the modern analogue, moral courage looks different. It is the work of diplomats who refuse to accept dehumanizing narratives, of citizens on both sides who call for restraint, of journalists and historians who keep memory honest, and of faith communities who, even while alarmed, refuse to reduce their theology to triumphalism. There is another thread worth tracking: memory and ritual. Purim survives as a communal memory that transforms trauma into a posture of gratitude and vigilance. In modern Jewish consciousness, remembering the past becomes a way of facing present peril without succumbing to despair. For Iranian Jews, the memory of being a minority under changing regimes continues to shape identity. For the state, the memory it chooses to cultivate, revenge or reconciliation, dominance or coexistence, will determine how its policies play out on the regional stage. Watching the contemporary headlines, one might be tempted to read the past as prophetic in a deterministic sense, that some ancient decree foretells modern events. That is not the careful reading this story demands. Instead, what I suggest is that a pattern emerges across time, a moral and political dramaturgy in which arrogance seeks absolute solutions, vulnerable groups face existential threats, and human courage, sometimes assisted by surprising turns of fate, can invert outcomes. The geography, the continuity of place, makes the pattern feel eerily immediate. Where once a gallows swung in a palace yard, today's power centers issue pronouncements, fund proxies, and shape public sentiment in ways that can carry equally grave consequences. The question becomes, will pride once again be humbled? What instruments of reversal might appear, and from what unexpected quarter? As we move on, we have to examine how the century between the Shah's Iran and the revolutionary regime saw the mechanics of international alignment change. We must look closely at the ways revolutionary ideology shaped policy, how slogans become doctrine, how religious legitimacy was marshaled for geopolitical aims, and how the export of revolutionary fervor transformed neighbors into theaters of conflict. We will need to trace the manner in which modern institutions, intelligence services, revolutionary guards, transnational militias, replaced the personal favor of court officials as the primary levers of power. And we must do this without succumbing to the temptation to dehumanize an entire nation for the decisions of its rulers. But even as we prepare to dive into those transformations, remember the central point. The title that guides us, the US and Israel at war with Iran, the prophecy that explained everything, is not an assertion of fatalism. It is an invitation to read history through a prophetic sensibility that discerns patterns of sin and grace, of hubris and humility, of human plotting and the unexpected openings that answer prayer and courage. The ancient narrative does not give us a battlefield blueprint. It gives us an ethic and an image. When power claims finality over life, when a decree seeks to obliterate a people, the moral universe still allows for reversal. The hard work is translating that ethic into the practical wisdom needed in diplomacy, intelligence, and public solidarity. So far we have followed the thread from palace to ruin, from story to terrain, and from history to modern politics. The next step, where the narrative becomes most urgent, is to examine in detail how the revolutionary transformation after 1979 reconfigured not only Iran's domestic order, but its foreign posture toward Israel and the West. We will need to unpack how ideological commitment can move from sermon to statecraft, and how that movement resembles yet differs from the personal malice of a court favorite like Haman. We will need to watch the interplay between rhetoric and action, when words of annihilation become strategy and when antagonism is channeled into proxies, embargoes, or rhetorical isolation. This is the point at which the ancient text presses hardest against the modern headline. The mechanisms have changed, the actors have shifted, but the moral arithmetic, pride seeks extermination, courage resists, reversal remains possible, presses on. Understanding the continuity helps us respond not with blind confidence or paralyzing fear, but with sober vigilance, informed prayer, and practical solidarity for affected peoples. It invites policymakers to craft strategies that aim for de-escalation and protection without dehumanizing an entire populace. It invites faith communities to intercede with both the prophetic fire that denounces injustice and the pastoral tenderness that refuses to hate. We will pick up that thread now, mapping with care how the revolutionary state shaped its identity in opposition to Israel and the West, and how that posture drew the United States and Israel into a strategic calculus that sometimes looks like containment and sometimes like confrontation. The stakes are not merely political, they are moral and spiritual. The same geography that once staged royal decrees now hosts rival narratives about legitimacy and survival. What happened in the decades after the Shah's fall will help explain why contemporary tensions have the shape they do, but it will also reveal where the space for reversal, for creative diplomacy, and for mercy might be found. The years after the fall of the Shah were not a simple exchange of rulers, but a reordering of meanings. The palace yielded to a new center of authority whose legitimacy was explicitly theological. The language of sacred duty replaced the pragmatic rhetoric of modernization. What had once been a state that, for all its faults, maintained strategic ties with the West and tolerated religious minorities became a revolution that saw its identity as inseparable from opposition. That shift did not happen overnight. It was the product of long social fractures, economic discontent, and ideological ferment. Yet in the space of a few years, the axis around which Iran defined itself tilted decisively away from the old alignments and toward a posture that read much of the global order through the lens of resistance. The leaders of the revolution framed their project as the export of a liberating cause. Revolution, by its nature, is both inward and outward. It seeks to reorder domestic life and to reshape the foreign field in which it stands. The new Iranian state invested in institutions designed to preserve and extend its ideological commitments. One of those institutions, born of the revolution's insistence on guarding its gains, was the Revolutionary Guard, a force with political, economic, and military wings whose mandate, in the revolutionary imagination, was to defend the revolution from internal decay and external coercion. Where courtly favor once decided access to the king, The new order relied on organizations with the capacity to project influence beyond borders, training, funding, and advising proxy actors who could advance Tehran's strategic aims without necessarily engaging in direct interstate warfare. These proxies are part of the modern analogue to the court favorites and satraps of old, though they operate in a vastly different environment. In Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, across a region scarred by competing ambitions, non-state groups have sometimes acted as extensions of state policy. Support for such movements can be framed by the regime as solidarity with oppressed peoples. External observers often read the same support as a means of exerting leverage and expanding regional influence. The consequences have been profound. Armies have found themselves fighting in urban centers where civilians are trapped, humanitarian crises have multiplied, and the fog of proxy contests has blurred lines of responsibility. These dynamics complicate the moral calculus. How do you defend allies and deter aggression without contributing to cycles of violence that victimize innocents? If Haman's power derived from an office and the ear of a king, the revolutionary state's influence has derived from institutions and networks. The rhetoric that emerges from such a system can be aggressive in tone. Some leaders have used apocalyptic or absolute language when speaking of Israel, framing the conflict as moral and existential. Such rhetoric functions for domestic consolidation as much as foreign intimidation. It simplifies complex geopolitics into moral binaries that rally supporters and delegitimize opponents. Yet rhetoric is not destiny. Words create danger when they harden into policy, and when they are accompanied by instruments designed to make them true. That is when the impulses that the Book of Esther warns against, absolute denunciation, legal marginalization, and decrees that close out negotiation, become a lived reality. American policy toward Iran, for its part, has been shaped by an evolving mix of containment, engagement, and punitive measures. Washington's approach has shifted with administrations, with strategic priorities and domestic politics influencing whether diplomacy or pressure predominates. The United States' alliances and commitments in the region, including a special relationship with Israel, create overlapping security dilemmas, protecting partners, deterring adversaries, and seeking to prevent the spread of weapons that could escalate conflict. These imperatives produce their own kinds of moral hazards. When a global power treats a regional actor as an existential enemy, it can shrink the space for diplomatic creativity and push adversaries into asymmetric strategies. The triangular tension the title names, the US, Israel, and Iran, bound together in rivalry, is thus not a simple story of good and evil, but a knot of historical grievances, strategic fear, and domestic politics on all sides. Nuclear anxieties have become a particular pressure point for this triangular relationship. The possibility, or perception, that a state might develop nuclear weapons raises the stakes of every rhetorical exchange. It concentrates fear and can harden policies into maximalist positions. Negotiations aimed at preventing nuclear proliferation, such as the international agreement reached in 2015 and the subsequent cycles of withdrawal and renewed pressure, have shown how fragile diplomatic arrangements can be when mistrust runs deep. Yet even here, the pattern we have traced in Esther offers a tempering thought. Technologies and treaties may seem irreversible once set in motion, and decrees and policies can cast long shadows. But history has repeatedly shown that what looks inevitable is not always so. Human agency, international coalitions, and shifting domestic politics can produce openings. The theological point is not that God guarantees a particular political outcome. It is that providence, mercy, and moral courage can appear in unexpected places to redirect the course of events. It is crucial to say plainly, the people who suffer most from these geostrategic contests are ordinary civilians. In cities where protests erupt, in refugee camps crowded with families displaced by proxy warfare, in homes where children grow up knowing only conflict. The human cost is immediate. Iranian dissidents, protesters, men and women who simply want to live without revolutionary coercion, face repression. Israeli civilians who have endured missile barrages and terror attacks live under a different but no less heavy shadow. American service members and diplomats stationed in the region bear risks that are both physical and psychological. The prophetic reading we are exploring must never become an instrument that desensitizes us to suffering or justifies policies that worsen it. This is why the distinction between Iran's regime and its people matters so much. Millions of Iranians have been at the forefront of cultural renewal, artistic flourishing, and political dissent. Within Iran, there have been persistent debates, protests, and moments of conscience that resist theocratic absolutism. The diaspora, Iranians abroad, including many Jews, Christians, Baha'is, and secular citizens, creates networks of memory and critique that complicate any simplistic narrative about monolithic identity. To hold the regime accountable is necessary. To treat an entire nation as the incarnation of a state's worst impulses is not only inaccurate but morally perilous. One of the most poignant continuities between the ancient and modern story is how minority communities weather such shifts. Iranian Jews in particular offer a long view of resilience. Their history on the plateau spans centuries, at times protected, at times persecuted, yet persistently present. After 1979, many faced insecurity and chose exile, contributing to a vibrant diaspora in Israel, North America, and Europe. Those who remained navigated a delicate balance of loyalty to homeland and fidelity to religious identity. The memory of Esther's deliverance resonates differently for them. It is not merely a story about ancient salvation, but a living echo in families who have known both integration and exclusion. The festival of Purim, the ritual retelling, the reading that transforms horror into gratitude, these acts of memory do theological work. They refuse to let trauma be the final word. Archaeology and tradition, meanwhile, continue to complicate our certainty. Sites attributed to Esther and Mordecai, tombs venerated by local communities, and records of Jewish synagogues in places like Hamadan and Susa have been points of continuity and contest. Scholars debate exact identifications. Popular piety sustains memory. That interplay between text, tradition, and ruin is itself a theological mirror. God's purposes, in biblical imagination, sometimes work through institutions that are fragile and through remembrances that persist in the margins. The persistence of place, the stones that remain even when banners change, invites humility in our prognostications. Geography endures where regimes do not. What then does a prophetic reading, faithful to the Book of Esther and cautious in its application, ask of us today? First, it urges vigilance. Not the paranoid kind that imagines conspiracy behind every headline, but a sober attentiveness to how rhetoric can harden into policy. Leaders who dehumanize opponents make it easier for populations to accept extreme measures. Where laws are written to exclude, where decrees are framed as irreversible, the moral imagination of a society narrows. Recognizing that trend early, speaking against demonizing language, defending the dignity of opponents, is a form of prophetic intervention. Second, the pattern of reversal invites moral courage. Esther's courage was not political theater. It was a costly, embodied willingness to risk status and safety for the sake of others. In contemporary terms, moral courage looks like the diplomats who prefer long negotiations to escalatory rhetoric, the journalists who report inconvenient truths, the citizens who lobby for humane policies for refugees, and the faith leaders who refuse to collapse into tribalism. Courage is not the same as triumphalism. It is a steadiness of heart that persists under fear and chooses mercy over the corrosive attractions of totalizing hatred. Third, the prophetic lens insists on practical wisdom. Theologies that imagine God as a partisan cosmic ally for a particular policy misread Scripture's complexity. The biblical witness repeatedly calls the faithful to prudence, to weigh consequences, to prefer peace where possible, to protect the vulnerable. That means supporting measures that seek de-escalation and protection without endorsing injustice. It means working with allies to prevent nuclear proliferation, while also investing in conflict resolution mechanisms that reduce the appeal of proxies and sectarian mobilization. It means supporting civil society, education, and cultural exchange that widen the circle of human sympathy. Fourth, and perhaps most spiritually demanding, the pattern compels prayer that is informed and humble. Prayer is not an escape from political responsibility. It is a disciplined orientation of the heart that shapes action. To pray intelligently about the US-Israel-Iran triangle is to educate oneself, to listen to experts, to stand with the afflicted, and to enter the public square with a posture that refuses both fear-mongering and naive optimism. The Book of Esther teaches that faith without action is hollow. The Queen's private fasting preceded public intervention. Likewise, prayer that moves us only to private lament without grappling with public consequences falls short of Scripture's ethic. If we return to the title that frames this study, The US and Israel at War with Iran, the prophecy that explained everything, we must be careful about what the phrase explained everything actually offers. It offers a hermeneutic, not a guarantee. The prophetic imagination helps us perceive patterns and moral shapes that recur across time. Pride that seeks to crush the other, decrees that unsettle societies, the unexpected ways humility and courage can invert outcomes. To read Esther as a kind of prophetic lens is to be invited into a long season of interpretation. We notice recurring dramas, we gird for complex responses, and we refuse the idol of definitive certainty. There are, then, practical implications for faith communities and policymakers alike. Churches and synagogues can become sites of both spiritual formation and practical advocacy, training congregants in how to read the world prophetically, mobilizing relief for those displaced by conflict, and creating platforms for interfaith dialogue that resist tribal consolidations. Religious leaders can speak truth to power, naming injustice when it occurs and resisting the simplifications of political rhetoric. Policymakers, for their part, must balance deterrence with diplomacy, supporting allies while keeping open channels for negotiation that might forestall escalation. Importantly, our response must always protect the dignity of civilians. Humanitarian corridors, refugee support, and independent monitoring of conflict zones are not neutral bureaucratic tasks. They are moral imperatives. Supporting institutions that document abuses and provide aid helps to keep the human face visible amid geopolitical abstractions. Memory plays its role here as well, memorializing victims, teaching history with fidelity, and sustaining rituals like Purim that transform trauma into a witness of faith and survival. What can hopeful Christians expect? Not guarantees of worldly triumph, nor simplistic assurances that God will unilaterally deliver nations in ways that bypass human agency. Instead, they are called into a long obedience, persistent prayer, wise witness, courageous intervention, and patient work for the common good. The God who surprises kings in palace courts may also surprise political systems today. But how that surprise unfolds will often be through human acts of repentance, coalition building, and creative peacemaking. It is worth closing with a note about humility and hope. Humility recognizes our limits. Our policies will fail sometimes. Our best-laid plans will be complicated by unforeseen variables. Hope refuses fatalism. The biblical memory of reversals, the proud humbled, the vulnerable vindicated, is not a license for passivity. It is a spur to persistent engagement. Where hatred is institutionalized, hope points to the possibility of change. Conversions of conscience, shifts in leadership, grassroots movements that reassert dignity, and international efforts that reweave the fabric of trust. So what should you, watching now, take into your life? Stay informed with sources that prize sober analysis over sensational headlines. Pray with both urgency and restraint. Name the real human suffering involved and ask for wisdom for leaders. Support organizations that protect civilians and provide aid. Maintain compassion for people whose governments you may oppose. Remember that memory and ritual, the retelling of stories like Esther's, do not simply celebrate past deliverances. They teach communities how to live faithfully amid peril. The prophetic lens does not claim to forecast every twist of contemporary geopolitics. It does something subtler and more robust. It trains our eyes to see moral patterns, to notice when power seeks to erase persons, and to act in ways that prefer life over the logic of annihilation. Where decrees aim to silence, the faithful are called to speak. Where plots aim to exclude, the faithful are called to open tables. In those small but consequential acts, history's reversals are born. If this study has helped you think more clearly about how ancient narratives inform modern dilemmas, if it has given you a framework for prayerful engagement and sober activism, consider supporting this channel so we can produce more researched, historically grounded reflections. In the description, you'll find links to a downloadable study guide, recommended readings, and resources for further learning. Join a community that seeks to interpret the signs of the times without abandoning the neighbor. Together we can learn to respond with courage, wisdom, and steadfast hope. May that hope shape your mind, steady your heart, and inform your witness in a world where the same hills and valleys that once hosted kings now lay at the center of urgent decisions. The arena is different, the actors transformed, but the moral stakes remain. Preserve the dignity of the vulnerable, resist language that dehumanizes, and work, by whatever means you can, for the reversal of injustice. In that work, perhaps, we find the truest echo of the Queen's courage, a small, decisive act that helps bend history toward life.